Hey there, I'm Joshua Sheehan. Welcome to the RV Entrepreneur Podcast. The RV Entrepreneur is a community for RVers that are exploring ways to financially support themselves while living their RV life. My family and I are out in the western side of the country, and we recently just left one of the most scenic campgrounds that I've been to in a while. If you guys have heard of Bryce and Ellie from the Georgies, they have bought a campground in Swan Valley, Idaho. It's called The Park at Swan Valley. And it's a small park at the moment that they're turning into a much larger park. You know, it's really cool to travel across the country and be able to stay at other full-time families' RV parks, especially when we met them through the RV Entrepreneur community. So I met Bryce and Nellie last year at the RV Entrepreneur Summit. They were presenting as one of the presenters, but we really just hit it off at one of the campfires after a day of learning and networking and connecting. And so when we launched full-time last fall and we were coming through, we said, when we get into Idaho, we got to make it a point to go see Bryce and Nellie. But when we got there, you're in the middle of this valley, Swan Valley, Idaho, and there's just mountains all around you. It is absolutely stunning, the views that you get from your rig parked in this valley. They also have an airstrip on their RV park, which is pretty cool because they're talking about doing some glamping stuff, like fly-in glamping. So it's a pretty cool place. You're within driving distance of the Tetons, Yellowstone, all those major attractions that are in the Wyoming, Idaho, Montana area. And I really encourage you, if you want to support another RV entrepreneur family, another full-time family, hard charging, some of the nicest people you ever meet, when you're going through eastern Idaho, check out the park at Swan Valley. I promise you, Bryce and Nellie are some of the most genuine people that you will meet in your life. And because Bryce and Nellie are content creators themselves, I find it pretty cool that it lined up with this week's episode. This week, we have the pleasure of speaking with Ammar. Aaron is the co-founder of Y Risk, an underwriting company providing insurance solutions for companies in the on-demand and sharing economy, and started his role as Chief Insurance Officer for Roamly in August 2021. Roamly was created by Outdoorsy to help facilitate their insurance needs. Outdoorsy is a sharing platform where folks can rent out their RVs to other individuals. However, there's always issues with insurance policies when you go and you rent something commercially. And so Roamly was created in order to fill that gap in the insurtech space, allowing folks to rent out their RVs with insurance policies that affirmatively declare, yes, you can rent this on platforms like Outdoorsy. And as Chief Insurance Officer, Aaron harnesses his experience in the insurance space to lead and build out the Roamly team as the company ventures into previously uncharted territory in the insurtech space, insurance and technology. Roamly's parent company, Outdoorsy Holdings, received $125 million in fresh funding in June 2021 to accelerate Roamly's product innovation and international expansion. And in April in 2022, Roamly launched its global travel insurance product in response to the rebound of international travel and the need to protect consumers from financial losses should a trip be delayed, interrupted, or canceled. This conversation with Aaron is really cool. I know as content creators and full-time RVers, there's a lot of question around what type of insurance I need. Is a personal policy going to cover me if I'm doing business? If I have a YouTube channel, do I need a commercial policy? If I'm running a family TikTok page or an Instagram account, but I'm posting things about my RV and I'm making money, do I need a commercial policy, or does that fall under things that would normally be on a personal policy? But we're going to ask Aaron all those questions. Now, after my conversation with Aaron, I went and did some research and some shopping on my full-time RV insurance. And I'll talk a little bit more about it at the outro of the podcast episode, but I will give you a spoiler alert. We are now customers of Roamly RV Insurance for our full-time RV insurance. Again, I'll give you more information at the end, but before we jump into the episode, let's make sure we take care of our sponsors. The RV Entrepreneur Podcast is brought to you in part by RV Life Pro. Perfect for every RVer, you can plan your camping trips with RV Life Trip Wizard, then use the RV Safe navigation with the RV Life GPS and Campgrounds app. Both are included in RV Life Pro. Eliminate RV anxiety by knowing exactly where you'll camp, get fuel, and even grab lunch before you ever hit the road. RV Life has every campground, RV park, state park, and national park to fit your style. Plan your entire RV adventure, including fuel stops, rest areas, shopping, and entertainment. Go to RVLife.com and start your free 7-day trial, or download the RV Life app from the App Store. Travel dreams made simple with RV Life. Now, as with anything insurance related, I need to give it a small disclaimer here. Aaron's advice and responses are general and sometimes broad. Make sure you consult a Roamly insurance agent for more specific and granular details when determining whether a Roamly policy is right for you and your vehicle. Awesome. Aaron, welcome to the RV Entrepreneur Podcast. I'm super excited to get you on the line here. You work with Roamly RV Insurance, and I'm super excited because there's a lot of questions out there about insurance. But before we dive into the nitty gritty of some detailed questions, give me some background. Who is Aaron? What did you do? How'd you get into insurance? And then proceed on a little bit and tell me a little bit about Roamly.
Hey, Joshua, first off, it's great to meet you today. Really, it's a pleasure being here and being able to have this conversation with you. But as you mentioned, we're Roamly Insurance Group. We are focused on the RV industry as a whole and making sure we can kind of provide appropriate coverage. Right now, we've got a fantastic team in place for being able to provide insurance to the entire industry. Our sister company, Outdoorsy, is the platform to be able to rent and list RVs. And so we're integrated with the Outdoorsy platform as a whole to be able to provide insurance. And so we're working with some great partners in this space, with individuals, with different fleets as a whole. And again, really excited to be here today and just share a little bit more about the company as a whole.
So how did Roamly come to be?
Roamly, it's actually a 7-year iteration of a startup as a whole. Outdoorsy and Roamly really kind of came about in the 2014, 2015 arena, whereby Outdoorsy was created to really be able to foster the rentals of RVs, to be able to bring what's historically a class of business that's been offline, online. And with that, recognize that insurance was a fundamental part of the equation to be able to rent out vehicles. So really be able to went out to create some insurance offerings for the space. That way, when people rent out their vehicle, and that's how Roamly came to be. And so as part of it, it's actually a spin out of Outdoorsy, as I mentioned earlier, a sister company together, whereby we're now able to provide insurance to Outdoorsy, other platforms, RV owners across the board. So it's an exciting time in an industry that is booming. Obviously, the COVID and pandemic had a big impact as a whole, and the industry continues to grow right now pretty rapidly. So we're just getting started, and it's an awesome journey ahead. And that's a little bit about how it came to be.
So originally the insurance coverage was built out of necessity. Outdoorsy is trying to get people to rent units. And obviously the biggest concern for RV owners is my RV covered while I'm making money on it, renting through Outdoorsy. So Roamly came into play to kind of fill that gap. And I've done research for myself as being a full-timer. At what time did full-time RV insurance come into that picture? Because I assume it's not the main goal of Roamly, but it's a product that you guys offer.
Yeah, that's correct, Joshua. So really, as it kind of came to be, you described it very articulately on that basis there, that in majority of RV insurance policies, there's often a clause. It's called that thou shalt not rent clause. That's a little bit tongue in cheek, but it effectively means that if you rent out your RV and make any sort of money on it, we don't necessarily want to cover you. Mm-hmm. So in the event of a claim, you could actually not have any sort of coverage because you're actually making money on that vehicle. So part of the big impetus in terms of creating appropriate insurance as tailored for the sharing and on-demand economy was to be able to remove that commercial use exclusion that does not void coverage. And so in the event of a claim, it would ultimately be covered. So what we did was we created insurance policies that would affirmatively allow renters and owners to be able to rent the rig on the platform itself and not be covered in the event of a claim. So that was a huge differentiator that was created at the onset of Roamly and making sure that we had appropriate coverages. And then to your point about the full-timers as a whole, yeah, that's exactly right. That is a product that we offer. It is a product that we sell with our annual insurance policies. So let's say, for example, you, Joshua, are a full-timer and you're looking for appropriate coverage as you're on the road. We created annual insurance policies that would provide the full-timers coverage and other coverages as well whenever you are not rented on the platform. So what we did was we initially started out having a product offering during the rental period that would ultimately cover the owner and the renter. And then to ensure that there were no coverage gaps, created a product for the non-rental period. So that would be whenever you're in your car on vacation or with your family driving around on that basis there. And combination of those two products covers the user across the entire kind of spectrum and life of that RV. And that's that's a little bit about the offering there. Our non-rental product doesn't cover the actual rental period, but whenever you would rent it through Outdoorsy or another platform on that basis, that's whenever you would have that rental period coverage as well.
Give me a bit more, and maybe there is no broader aspect, but what are the product offerings that Roamly offers? Is it just rental insurance and then non-rental insurance for RVs only?
Yeah, so we do rental insurance for the RVs that we're talking about there. We also do the non-rental insurance on an annual basis. So we do the non-rental insurance for individuals, like, for example, yourself, and or also fleets. So that could be actually your rental car or your RV rental companies, anybody that owns anywhere between 1 to 500, right? There's no cap effectively on that basis, but we can really insure all the fleets. And those are some of the RV products itself. But one of the other things, or some of the other things that we also do as well, is we provide interior damage coverage. So in the event that the inside of the RV is banged up or ruined on that basis there, we have interior damage insurance that we provide coverage for. We also have what is called trip cancellation insurance. And so that would be in the event, let's just use an example. If you book your vehicle through the Outdoorsy platform and you are booked out in, let's say, 3 weeks from now, and something comes up and you want to be able to cancel your trip, we also have trip cancellation insurance. So you could get a refund for the booking that you ultimately had a couple weeks down the road. So that's some trip cancellation insurance. We also have pet insurance as well. One of the things that we found in the camping industry and RV industry as a whole is that folks like to bring their pets a lot of times everywhere that they go. So we created a product for pet insurance as well. So that way, that is also an offering that Roamly provides on that basis too. So a suite of products right now that we're continually always looking to build out as a whole. And so just to really be able to cater to the RV industry.
So obviously a motorized RV is included in that coverage. Well, personal vehicles, like a truck or a car, do you guys provide insurance for that?
We are able to provide insurance for that. The main kind of focus, at least for now, yes, is the motorized vehicles and the trailers. And those are the ones we went out and kind of been able to create our own products.
So when a customer calls into Roamly, what are some of the things that they don't know to ask, or things that maybe when your customer service rep is explaining the product offerings that they're like, wow, I didn't know that was something that I could get insurance for?
Right. Yeah. So one of the biggest things right off the bat is just the fact that the number one question that comes up all the time is, am I able to rent my vehicle and make money from the RV whenever it's listed on a platform like Outdoors? That's a number one that we'll get across the board. And then the very short answer, like we talked about a little bit about earlier on that, is that yes, we went out and created a product that allows them and owners to affirmatively rent their vehicles on the platforms and be able to make money for that. So that would be number one. Number two is another one that also will come up a little bit, is a little bit about windshield coverage. It's majority of times it's people may not know to ask, should I ask explicitly, is there a certain deductible just for the windshield coverage or not? Or is it subject to the deductible of the policy? There's an optional coverage that if you want to buy windshield or glass coverage, there's an option that you may not have any deductible at all. You could actually have a lower deductible for your windshield coverage than you may have for the actual deductible on the policy in the event of an accident. So I would say those are the top two that would come up.
Policies as far as rental days and non-rental days. Is there a rule of thumb, a general rule across the board, that if my RV is costing me X amount of dollars on a non-rental day, that it's going to cost extra dollars on a rental day?
There's no general rule of thumb in terms of what the cost is. And the reason behind that is that it's multiple factors that go into the rates. So for example, it depends on whether or not it's a trailer or a motor. It also depends on the state that you may be in. And it also depends on the value of the vehicle as a whole. So there's no explicit general rule of thumb on that. But as we think about the rental offerings as a whole, let's just use Outdoorsy for an example. If you rent through the Outdoorsy platform, we'll offer effectively 3 different bundles. You kind of have low, medium, and high, and they'll offer different limits and different coverage on that as well. So while no explicit, let's just say, cost rule of thumb, because it varies based on all those different rating variables, we do simplify in a manner for the rental insurance there. And then as we think about the non-rental insurance, the same sort of concept actually applies. You can kind of imagine if you are in southern tip of Florida where it is high hurricane season and windier weather than, let's say, for example, the middle of Washington or South Dakota, there are different geographies that ultimately have different impact on insurance rates and regulated rates that are out there as well. So there's a variety of things that factor into it. And so that's how we can kind of think a little bit about the cost. It varies quite a bit across the board.
And how is the geography and the geographic region handled? Obviously, an RV is intended to move, intended to travel. If I rent out my RV and I live in Washington State and the customer ends up taking it to Florida, there's a lot of distance there, a lot of different climates and scenarios that something could come up that would incur an insurance claim. How does that get handled?
In those instances, oftentimes the insurance industry, they kind of, let's just say the fundamental rates are often derived off of a zip code level. And so it could be, hey, majority of the year, it's going to be housed in this location. So that would oftentimes serve as the basis of developing a rate there. However, because insurance is often a law of large numbers on that basis, you'll look at it in aggregate and oftentimes on averages as a whole too. So let's take full-time insurance for an example. If you are going to be on the road longer than 6 months out of the year, we'll kind of take, let's say, hey, for example, you might be in the middle of Texas initially, then you're going to be driving around. There are different adjustments that you'll make to the rate to assume that it's going to be in all the different locations across the entire US. So while you might be in Texas, you might be in Washington, you might be in Florida, all of those different locations, what we'll often try to do is get a sense of kind of the average rates on the back end. And when somebody would purchase full-timers insurance, we would have accounted for that in the, let's just say, in developing the pricing. And that's how we would ultimately end up on a final premium.
So this applies to both full-timers and to rental units. RVs have a specific amount of weight that they can carry. And sometimes I've seen going down the road, I guarantee that this person is overweight on their axles or the weight rating of the vehicle. Are weight tickets something that ever comes into play with the insurance coverage?
So right now, no, in short, the weight tickets are not. However, whenever we think about RVs as a whole, weight is something that we ultimately think about on that basis. But with that, one of the things that we try to do whenever RVs are ultimately rented out as well is it's really an education process as a whole, where you want to just really try to be able to educate the owners as well as the renters that, you know, you've got to make sure that the vehicle that is towing the trailer is able to hold that weight capacity as a whole. But broadly speaking, we really underwrite each one of the different RVs that come into play and that we want to be able to provide insurance on at the onset. And so we're able to assess, hey, you know what, let's look at the driving history of the owner. Let's take a look at the RV. Let's look at the age. Let's take a look at the condition as a whole and then be able to provide that coverage at the onset. But as a whole, the weight tickets is not something that is oftentimes incorporated into the claims handling process. So with that, we look at it really on the front end and within the underwriting to be able to make sure that we're providing the coverage.
Gotcha. Okay, so I want to dive a little bit more into and focus on full-time insurance because I know a lot of our listeners are they're entrepreneurs running a business on the road and they're living full-time in their RV. So getting a little more specifics into that. Texas, South Dakota, Florida are three of the top domicile states for many reasons. From an insurance standpoint, is there one state that provides more benefit than another?
So right off the bat, we try to make sure that we can provide an equal amount of benefit across the different states. With that, the item that we were talking a little bit about earlier is oftentimes the rating. So it comes back to that in a state like Florida, you might be impacted by hurricanes. You might see a little bit higher rates than South Dakota in the middle of the country that sees potentially less hurricanes. Mm-hmm. Or, for example, you might be in Texas that could be hit by hurricanes, hail, wind, flooding. So your rates could be a little bit different than what it might be in the middle of New Mexico as a whole. So as a general theme, try to make sure that we provide the appropriate coverage, while oftentimes the rates could vary on a geographic basis as well.
And that's all just going to be based off of where your zip code is for the insurance policy.
Yes, that's oftentimes where the kind of the basis of the rating would be.
Mm-hmm. Talk to me about the different offerings of replacement cost versus actual cost on the RVs.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have multiple offerings on how you would ultimately value your vehicle. We have what is called actual cash value, we have replacement cost, and we also have agreed value. As we think about those, it's oftentimes the replacement cost versus actual cash value. The replacement cost versus the actual cash value, for a high level example, replacement cost is the amount paid to replace it without any deduction for depreciation. Well, the actual cash value is the replacement cost minus the depreciation. Those are two ways to actually value a vehicle there. And then we also have an option as well for the agreed value, which would effectively mean that at the onset of purchasing your policy, let's say a vehicle is worth $50,000. Well, what we would do is we would collect some information and some paperwork that affirmatively shows that the vehicle is worth that 50,000, or it might get an appraisal that says it's worth 40,000. We can agree the amount of the vehicle at the onset of purchasing coverage. So that way, that is the amount that would be subject to the maximum amount that could be paid out in claim. So there are different options that we're able to provide when settling a claim for the different policies. And each one of those, replacement cost, agreed value, actual cash value, can be determined at the onset. And as either they're going through our flow at roamly.com to be able to purchase a vehicle, or they're actually talking to one of our insurance agents, something that we can easily talk somebody through in terms of which one is the best benefit for the owner that is looking to purchase it.
Mm-hmm. So then with full-time RV insurance, obviously the contents within the RV are covered. Do you select the amount of coverage that you want for a dollar amount of what you would have considered your value of belongings inside the vehicle? And then to piggyback on that, does that include things that are outside of the vehicle? So if we have a pop-up shelter or e-bikes or things that are not necessarily inside the vehicle, but could be stolen or damaged, would those be encompassed into a full-time policy?
Yes, absolutely. So we have one of the things whenever we're creating our policy as well is to be able to have the optionality for full-timers whenever they're on the road. So to your first question around how do we think about the items inside the vehicles? Well, yes, it's available in terms of different increments. So you can purchase different value of vehicles. Let's say you have $10,000 worth of items in your vehicle, you could purchase a $10,000 limit. Mm-hmm. Or let's say you have $1,000 worth of items in your vehicle, you could also purchase a $1,000 limit. So right off the bat, there are opportunities to be able to purchase it based on that spectrum for the items and what we call in the insurance world personal effects on your policy. And then with that, we also provide coverage, what is called full-timers shed storage contents. And so that would mean, for example, it might be in a shed that's owned or rented or leased by you that is somewhere else. And so we can provide up to $5,000 limit to cover the personal effects while it's inside a shed. Those are some of the coverage offerings that we'll offer for the contents of the vehicle there. And then you're comment about how do we think about kind of some of the bike racks or bikes that would typically be on a vehicle. Now, generally speaking, permanently installed items are oftentimes considered part of the vehicle. So it might be a permanently installed bike rack on the top of the RV or on the back of the RV. And so oftentimes that would be typically kind of considered part of the vehicle. Mm-hmm. Again, each case could be unique and also often depends on the type or how it's ultimately mounted by the vehicle. But generally speaking, if it is permanently installed, it would be kind of considered part of the vehicle. So that bike rack that is permanently installed might be covered. The items that may not be permanently installed may not be covered on an actual auto policy itself. Oftentimes they're kind of, let's say, lower limit items too. But that's how we would ultimately think about some of the different personal effects. Again, personal effects in insurance would be your personal belongings as a whole there too. If I just go ahead and expand upon that a little bit more too, is that as we think about, let's think about if somebody has a camera gear while they're on a hike or electric bicycles or generators there. We do have an optional offering that is called replacement cost personal effects, whereby that would ultimately provide some coverage for these items that I just mentioned here up to a supplement on the policy as well that would be purchased at the onset of the policy. So that is an offering that we could potentially provide for the personal items within a full-time RV policy.
Gotcha. So it's coverage that we can add. And then, so as far as the shed storage contents, that's basically, if we have a shed at a permanent site, or if we have a storage unit somewhere else, we can get coverage. It sounded like up to $5,000 worth with that product option.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, cool. As far as documentation for those personal effects, is there anything that you would recommend to folks that they have as proof of what contents were or were not in the RV?
Yes, of course. So as part of some of the different documentation, there's two different coverage offerings. One, it would be called scheduled personal effects, and another one would be unscheduled personal effects. And to elaborate a little bit more on each of those, scheduled personal effects effectively means that it's written down. So at the onset of the insurance policy, you would say, hey, I have a computer, I have a camera, I have camping equipment that's on here. And you would ultimately list that actually on the insurance policy, and that would be called scheduled. And then there would be an associated price along with that. Then you also have unscheduled personal effects on the policy as well, which basically means that you want to purchase a limit of insurance, but not necessarily list all the different items that are on there. And so on that one there, you could say, hey, I have a camera, I have camping equipment, and I have a bicycle that's on there. And well, there would be an associated charge and a price for that. Because of the fact that you may not be scheduled on the policy, the difference between the scheduled and the unscheduled personal effects might be slightly different. But oftentimes, as a rule of thumb, it is one, take pictures. So you can easily take some pictures and be able to prove that you do have the items in the RV. So that is one way to have some documentation in the event of a claim. It's also just by having kind of some of your receipts or different items that is there. But oftentimes I would say I'd come back to the first thing I just mentioned there would be having pictures that it is indeed near the RV, in the RV, and the event of a potential claim.
If folks are coming to you to get a quote for their insurance, you guys walk through the questions trying to make sure that you've got enough coverage for what their need and what their desires and their uses are. What are some of the places that folks tend to be underinsured before they get into a new policy with you guys?
I'd say one of the most common reasons that a claimant might be denied oftentimes is just the fact that we've seen it happen, that a policy may not be enforced when an actual loss occurred. So it's something that sounds very basic, but either somebody had their insurance coverage lapse or they didn't pay for their coverage. It was not, I would say, up to date on it. That's something that we've seen claims denied for on that basis. But again, that's what we try to get ahead of that by oftentimes providing reminders and follow-ups and schedules. So that's one piece of it as well there. The other piece, and this kind of comes back to the renting of your vehicle. Early on, one of the big things in majority of insurance policies that existed out there is that commercial use exclusion that effectively says, again, you're not able to rent your vehicle for any money, otherwise you're not covered. We've seen claims denied on that basis before in the past because of the fact that they didn't have the appropriate coverage on the policy. Again, that's why we went out to create our own insurance product that effectively says we will affirmatively allow you to rent your vehicles on platforms like Outdoorsy to be able to make money on your RV.
Mm-hmm.
Well, those are kind of a couple of reasons around what we've seen kind of the claims denied. But to your point exactly, is that we want to walk each one of the users through it and make sure that we can really understand it. And if they want to bind online, they can absolutely do that and go through the flow. And we try to provide some of the education and the questions that we have around, hey, this is the stuff that you need to know about purchasing an RV insurance policy. And this is how we want to ultimately help. Now, to your question about underinsured, we try to always insure to value. So we don't run into many underinsured situations. Let's say, for example, an RV that is worth $30,000. We have the databases and the intel to be able to look at it and say, yes, roughly it is in line with that $30,000. So we'll put an actual cash value on your policy, and that's the coverage that you would have there. So there's not often times that we'll see underinsured situations. Now, it could happen, but those are things that we try to very much get ahead of on the underwriting to make sure that we can help all of our clients and make sure that they are always insured.
Now, talk to me about the types of RVs that are covered through Roomly. There's a lot of people doing schoolie conversions. I've seen some pretty awesome cargo trailer conversions, homemade RVs. Are there certain restrictions on which type of RVs can and cannot be insured?
Yeah, so one of the big differentiators that we've created in the market as well is that we do insure DIY and professional van conversions and cargo trailer conversions as well. So that is something that we are able to do. And there's an entire market for let's say the conversion vans that we're able to help and created some unique coverages for that. And really just based on how it would be defined within the policy as well. On the flip side, though, we do not insure the schoolies or the homemade RVs there. So that is something that is out of our underwriting appetite there. But one of the big offerings, too, is just the ability to be able to provide some coverage for the DIY and conversion van industry as a whole, too.
Gotcha. So as long as it's a base vehicle starting out, like a van, DIY conversion can be covered, but something like a schoolie or a complete from the ground up is not.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
And as we even think about some of the conversion vans, we will bucket them further into, all right, is it a non-professional conversion van or is it a professional conversion? And we'll look at them a little bit differently based on some of the details around it. But as a whole, conversion van is something that we feel was an underserved market in the insurance industry. We really wanted to be able to provide an appropriate offering for that style of vehicle.
Right. So we've got a full-timer. They unfortunately get in an accident that is going to require significant repair to their RV. They're full-timing, so they're currently living in the RV. Are there options for coverage that allow and pay for alternative housing during the time of repair, and for how long? Obviously, we know dealers are swamped and service centers are weeks to months backed up. What kind of parameters do we need to talk about with that?
For sure. So yeah, we offer an optional coverage that is called emergency expense coverage. And in that instance, you can actually choose the limits that you ultimately want to have on the policy as well there. So the limits here actually will vary between $750 and $7,500. And so in that example there, it is in the repair shop and needs to get fixed. We would be able to cover some temporary living facilities. Maybe need some transportation back to your residence. There might be a cost incurred of returning the vehicle back to your residence. So yes, that is a coverage that we are able to provide in the event of a loss, whether or not it's a total loss or whether or not it's in the repair shop. But at the onset of it, they would effectively just look at the policy, say, I would need some emergency expense coverage, and then choose the appropriate limit. So that way, in the event of that scenario you just articulated there, they would be able to have some coverage.
So we've got commercial insurance for someone renting out their RV, and then we got full-time insurance. What about those folks that are running businesses from their RVs? This is a question that gets asked all the time in the RV Content Creators Mastermind group of, I'm making content about my RV. At what point do I need more than just a consumer level policy? At what point do I need commercial? And it's not necessarily rental, but I'm creating content about my RV. It's in TikTok videos or YouTube, Instagram stuff. Are there certain, I guess there's going to be multiple questions to that, but give me a basis of at what point do we need to consider having different things with the policy?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say each scenario in each business is a little bit different. So I'll start with that, but I'll give some general comments and some themes on it in terms of when do you transition from a personal policy to a commercial policy. So right off the bat, we'll see somebody that might own more than one RV. It might not be as common in the full-time industry, but you might have a family that has two RVs. They might use a trailer in some instances or a motorhome in different instances. What we'll often see is that if somebody has 2, 3, or more RVs, that would be a commercial policy. Makes intuitive sense on that basis.
Okay.
Another one would effectively be that the insurance needs to be, if there's a business that is in a business name or an LLC, oftentimes, or the RV is in the name of an LLC, that's also another common reason that you would want to transition from a personal policy to a commercial policy there too. And then also, as we just really kind of think about it, one of the things that we'll want to kind of just make sure is that if let's say it is the only vehicle and you might be commuting to and from a job as a whole, it might be a time for us to kind of think about, hey, let's transition from a personal policy to a commercial policy. Now, I say that from the stance of, again, each business could be a little bit different. Each business may have its own unique nuances, but that's one of the reasons that we have really a personal lines division and a commercial lines division to be able to kind of talk with each one of our clients and effectively be able to recommend, hey, you know what, this actually makes more sense on a commercial policy versus a personal policy, or vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
Now to your question around some of the different, let's just say somebody's using for YouTube or TikTok or making money about their vehicle. Again, one of the things that generally speaking, if it's branded or towed by something branded, then it's often intended to be on a commercial policy. So maybe there is a wrap on the vehicle or different decals on the vehicle that are all over. That's oftentimes when you may see it and say, hey, you know what, should I be considering this for commercial lines insurance? So that would be a question that would be able to speak to an insurance agent, a Roman insurance agent that effectively could kind of talk them through that as well. But broadly speaking, those are a couple of the parameters that we can think about in terms of transitioning from a personal policy to a commercial policy.
Gotcha. So it makes a little bit of sense. It also muddies the water for me a little bit, and maybe you can clarify. So it makes sense if I've got my entire RV wrapped, say like Harvest Host has a big, or Escapees, they have big fifth wheels that go over and they're totally wrapped going down the road. Makes total sense that they need to have a commercial policy. What if my family has started an Instagram page, or let's go with something they can actually make money from the bat? They've started a YouTube channel about their family travels. They've gotten big enough that they're making AdSense revenue from Google for those YouTube videos. If they put a spare tire cover with their YouTube channel on it, is that a point we need to be having these questions answered by a commercial agent?
Just right off the cuff, I would say that to me seems like that it could most likely fit on a personal lines policy as a whole. I mean, whenever we're kind of just talking about it's a tire cover that's on the vehicle, and that's how they're potentially advertising there. That would be kind of something, I would view that as something different than it being kind of a full, complete wrap on that basis there. So that in a situation like that, I would say it seems like it could fit on a personal lines policy. But again, that would be kind of a situation that, hey, you know what, we're kind of going through the underwriting process and looking on board. That could be a question that could be able to speak to an insurance agent in more detail on that.
Okay. And then, so I guess fulfilling my concerns as a consumer, I get on the phone, I call Romley, I say, hey, this is what we're doing. I'm making some money with YouTube, or maybe I have a brand that's sponsoring some content about RV stuff. We don't have a fully wrapped rig, but the front cap of my fifth wheel does have our channel name on it. And the agent comes back and says, no, I think based off all the parameters you gave and all the questions that I asked you and you answered, that you're good for a consumer level policy. Is there any sort of documentation to, I guess, have the consumer just a little peace of mind sleeping at night, knowing that that decision is not going to be reversed in the future? Do you get what I'm asking?
Yeah. No, I think I see what you're saying. So in an instance that, okay, we actually wrote the policy on a consumer basis, and then let's say something happens, it's a claim, and then a claim handler looks at it and says, oh, hey, you had some branding on the vehicle, we're going to deny your claim.
Right.
That is not something that we do. We actually have our own claims team in-house within Romley as well. So we're actually handling all of our own claims. So the beautiful thing about that is that our sales and underwriting team works very closely with our claims team as a whole too. So if we ever saw something like that where a sales agent or underwriting agent affirmatively said, hey, you know what, this is what the coverage is for, that's when our claims and underwriting team and sales team work together to kind of talk that out, to kind of give that peace of mind. Directly to your question on how do we think about that, I would say we don't have, like, let's say, a specific document that says, hey, we are going to cover you in the event of a claim because you had that. But what we do have is just the actual insurance policy. So we try to address all of our underwriting criteria and all of our underwriting, let's just say, questions at the onset. And if all of those questions are provided in an acceptable manner, then we would provide the policy. And that is oftentimes where, as long as it was raised at the onset and there were no concerns whenever it was written, that's oftentimes a peace of mind that we found that consumers have appreciated.
Okay. Is there any sort of parameters that you say, at this point on branding size or location that you definitely need to be asking these questions?
Yeah, so I would say as we think about a general rule of thumb, to me, having a logo on a wheel that is on the back of the car, that to me is something much smaller than it's a full complete wrap, or an entire side of the vehicle has decals and you're driving down the road and you absolutely cannot miss that it's a business vehicle. So a lot of times we get back to, again, using kind of general rule of thumbs, we get back to what makes, let's just say, common sense on that basis. Could we look at the vehicle and say, you know what? That vehicle is really being used for business use and it is branded. It is truly branded. Well, you know what? That should be a commercial. Mm-hmm. So that's how we would think about it from let's just say from a broad perspective. There is no, okay, if it's larger than 4x8 on the side of the vehicle, and to kind of the rule of thumb there, or let's say on the placement, it's on the left side of the vehicle. There's nothing explicit, I would say, in the insurance world for that specifically there, but I would just kind of come back to common sense in a sense of, all right, is it feel as though it's being used for business? Does it feel as though it's large enough that it's going to catch everybody's eyes, that we could look at it and say, that's business, that's commercial use. Well, in that instance, it's worth at least talking with a Roman insurance agent to sit here and say, hey, you know what? These are situations that are coming up. This is what I'm considering. You know what? I'm also considering putting my business in an LLC name. Right. And now, okay, well, now that makes more intuitive sense to be able to transition that over to a commercial policy as well. So my kind of quick go-to is oftentimes when in doubt, talk with a licensed insurance agent to be able to kind of talk through each one of those. But that's how we would think about it more broadly.
So the flip side of that coin, I have an RV that I use for making online content. I write a blog about RV maintenance. However, my truck or my motorhome and my trailer, there is no branding on it. Is at that point, we also need to consider commercial insurance?
So in that particular example there, that is probably, again, a scenario that we could kind of sit back and say, you know what, it's not branded. Okay, it passes that check mark box there. And you know what, should it be used for personal or commercial? Again, each scenario, I want to kind of make sure that we're hitting all the different check boxes. You know what, okay, is it branded or not branded? No. Okay, is it an LLC name? Yes or no? Is this the only vehicle that's in the household? Yes or no? And we can kind of keep going through those different check boxes to be able to determine, like, does it make more sense on a personal policy or does it make more sense on a commercial policy there? But in that instance that you were describing there, to me, right off the bat, it seems like you could potentially fit more on a personal lines policy. Each one of these nuanced scenarios, oftentimes best to speak with a licensed insurance agent. But what I'm trying to do here is just provide that directional insight to be able to say, hey, oftentimes this can be that scenario. Again, as I mentioned in the insurance world, it is black and white in terms of claims and the coverage itself. But kind of as we kind of think about each one of the scenarios, each owner could be slightly different. And so that's where oftentimes a conversation would be helpful right too.
Gotcha. And as much as I like online flows and not having to deal with getting someone on the line, it really seems to me like commercial insurance. And if you have any questions about that, that's definitely something that you're going to want to speak to a person with, right? You're not going to want to go through the flow of the questions on the website. You're going to eventually get to a stopping point where you're going to say, hey, we actually need to have a conversation about this.
Yes, Joshua, that's right. That's what we've often seen. We have that ability, but when folks are in the business and in the commercial space and they actually want to have a conversation, that's why we do have a team of licensed insurance agents that are experts in this space and dealing with this each and every day and are able to speak to each one of the different nuances for that particular client. So what we find is that, and I would say majority of the time that we find people want to talk about it more whenever we're talking about commercial insurance as a whole too.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Is sending photos back and forth a part of that process?
It can be. Yeah, it can be sometimes. So as part of it, it could be, hey, you know what? Hey, this is what I have. Can I send you a couple photos? What would your recommendation be? How should I think about this? Yes, it absolutely can be part of the process.
So I know a lot of full-timers, they'll be full-time for a few years and then they'll want to stay stationary for 6 months, or a season of life will change and they'll go get some property and put the RV up on a stationary spot. Are there different coverages that apply to an RV that's intended to be moving or something that is known to be stationary at a specific address?
Yeah, there is. And that's one of the things that we want to kind of keep a close pulse on it with our clients as well, is that oftentimes if they're going to be on the road, majority of the time, that's where we'll offer a full timers package. And so we'll affirmatively ask, hey, you know what, are you going to be on the road? And is this going to be your primary vehicle? Well, then, you know what, if so, then we want to be able to provide you with the appropriate coverage and pricing. So here's a full timers package. And so what we'll find is that that'll go on for a couple of years, and then we'll want to be able to revisit the coverage and policy. Just as a general rule of thumb for all users, myself included, even for, let's say, an automobile, it's always appropriate to be able to take every couple of years, take another closer look at your insurance coverage. Do I have the appropriate coverage? Do I have the appropriate price? And how do I sit back and think about that as a whole? And so oftentimes whenever there is a life change, there is a life shift where they do want to park the RV and let it be stationary for a little bit of time. That is a time to be able to call us and say, hey, you know what, this is what's going on. This is a life change. How should I be able to adjust my coverage? And then we can do that right down the fly.
Mm-hmm. Can you speak to how much difference in pricing a personal versus a commercial policy could be?
I would love to be able to have an affirmative answer on that basis there in terms of the difference between personal and commercial on that. However, each one, it kind of comes down to the unique rating variables and the geography that they're in. Oftentimes what we will find is that just the commercial is a little bit more expensive than the personal, just because it's being used for a different reason, or or there might be different coverages that are associated with it as well. I don't unfortunately have an exact answer in terms of a dollar amount, but that's oftentimes what we'll see as let's just say a rule of thumb.
Is it something that I'm going to expect double the price, 5 times the price, 10 times the price?
No, so I wouldn't expect like, let's say 5 times the price. It could be, depending on the class of business, it could be a little bit more to double the price on it. And again, depending on, there might be somebody that, let's say a commercial one has 10 vehicles, right? That might be a different price as a whole. But if I were to think about it, all right, is it one full-time RV? Do I use it as a personal policy, as a commercial policy? Most likely the commercial policy is a little bit more expensive than the personal policy, but I wouldn't say it's 5 times more expensive. It might be a little bit more expensive. It might be double the price. But again, each one might be a little bit different. And what we could do in those instances, and what we oftentimes do, is somebody wants a price, somebody wants to talk to us, and we'll provide that option. And then they'll be able to kind of understand and compare what does it look like between the two. And then we'll also be able to provide that insight in terms of, hey, you know what? Your current policy might be a personalized policy, but it might not have the appropriate coverage, or we might provide a different recommendation in terms of what should they have. So those are just different ways that we could think about it there too.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. What are some of the things that folks should be thinking about before they get on the phone to go through this process of getting coverage? What information do they need to have ready and available to make the process efficient for both parties?
We try to make it a very efficient process. So one of the unique things about Roamly is that we view ourselves as really that first RV-focused insurtech in the entire world as a whole. And so really being able to deliver a very seamless process, a very friendly process, a very, let's just say, intuitive process as a whole. So when somebody's coming in, they want to call in, first off, they'd be able to call in and say, hey, here's my name, here's my number, here's kind of some of the information about the individual. They would be able to have that very handily and readily available. All you really need is a license and information there. And then to have it about the RV, oftentimes we'll sit here and say, hey, what's the approximate value of the RV? What's the type of RV? What's your VIN number? Some of just the basics on that. And what we're able to do is we're able to tap into various databases and be able to pull that information as a whole. So generally speaking, we try to make it a very seamless process, but those would be some of the basic information that somebody would need whenever they would call in and have a conversation with us.
Yeah, very cool. I think Roamly's offering a super cool product. I think our society and our world is changing. Now we have consumers that are basically business owners with Airbnb and Outdoorsy, these short-term rentals of personal assets that really, I'm sure through the traditional insurance world, upside down, like, nope, you are just not touching it. So I think it's really cool that Roamly is stepping in and figuring out ways to solve these problems, because I think the scenarios are not going away. And rather than just ostrich and stick our head in the sand, you guys are finding solutions to these problems and making it so that everyone can move forward with the ultimate goal of, with RVs, it's getting people out, getting them traveling. When not everybody wants or needs to own an RV, there's plenty of them out there. Short-term rentals are a perfect fit. We just got to make sure that everyone, both the client, the owner, and the insurance company are doing their due diligence to get that done.
Absolutely. And Joshua, you hit the nail on the head. It's trying to bring in new, creative, innovative solutions to the industry as a whole that has historically not been, I would say, on the forefront of being creative in the RV insurance space as a whole. We're trying to change that on its head right off the bat and really put the customers and our clients at the forefront, just to make sure that they do have the appropriate coverage, that it is not ambiguous, and they do have the clarity and the insight needed as they are on the road and owning an RV.
Well, I think you've gave us some candid answers. I know there's some things that you can't get too deep into because it all depends. But if somebody wants to get on the line, see what things Roamly has to offer, talk through those options of do I or do I not need commercial insurance with what I'm doing, where's the best place for folks to get a hold of an insurance agent and see what products that Roamly offers might be appropriate for them?
Yeah, absolutely. If you just go to www.roamly.com, that's ROAMLY.com, and right on the back, folks can get a quote online right there pretty quickly, and they can also find the phone number right there on the forefront of the website. It's 877-725-1245. And you'd be able to reach out to anybody, and somebody on the team would be able to help anybody at any time.
Awesome. Aaron, thank you for taking the time out of your day and giving us some clarity to some of these ambiguous questions.
It's my pleasure, Joshua. Really appreciate you having me today.
I hope you guys enjoyed that episode with Aaron Ammar from Roamly RV Insurance. He was a super cool guy to talk to, very personable, very upbeat. The more research I did on Aaron before and after the interview, He's a super enthusiastic, optimistic entrepreneur, and he finds problems in spaces and creates solutions. Very into the insurance space, and Roamly being his major project right now of this insurtech world, insurance and technology, using your RV kind of like an Uber or an Airbnb. There's a lot of legal and insurance things that go along with that. And Roamly's trying to get on the cutting edge of making sure those things are safe for the consumer, safe for the renter, safe for the owner. And it's really cool, some of the products that they've offered. I said at the beginning of the episode that we are now Roamly customers. After my interview with Aaron, I went and jumped on their website, went through all the different prompts, eventually got to a point where I asked questions, or I answered questions that led them to say, hey, we need to talk to a person based off of the different tick marks that I use because of the businesses and entrepreneurial ventures that I run. But I jumped on the phone with an agent, went through all the different questions, went through all the different answers, gave them all the information, and ultimately we saved just under $200 a year on our full-time RV insurance, switching from Progressive to Roamly. Now, full disclosure, the only thing in our coverage that did change is we went from $15,000 roof replacement coverage down to $10,000 with Roamly. However, based off of the research that I did on my rig, $10,000 is enough to replace the entire roof on my rig. So I was totally okay reducing that coverage because I didn't need the $15,000 anyway. Again, as I stated before, all of Aaron's advice and responses were general and sometimes very broad because he can't give specific answers. Make sure you guys consult a Roamly insurance agent for more specific and granular details. That way you can determine whether a Roamly policy is right for you, your needs, and your vehicles. And I gotta say, in the RV content creators group, we've had a lot of questions about insurance. And again, it's all so granular and so specific to each person that one person will give their opinion or their experience, but it doesn't necessarily apply to another person because everything can be so specific. And so I really was excited to reach out to Roamly and say, hey, do you guys want to come on and try and answer some of these questions? Fully anticipating them to say, no, we're not touching that with a 10-foot pole. But Aaron was like, yeah, man, let's jump on. Let's talk about these questions and I'll give you as specific details as I can. And I thought that was really cool. It definitely shows that from the top down in Roamly that they are trying to take these hard questions, take these gray areas and define them as much as possible. Again, insurance, legality, it's all gray. And sometimes folks are just set in their way and companies just don't want to touch new and progressing things. I think it's really cool that Roamly is saying, hey, all those problems that you're having, we want to find solutions for you. So I definitely encourage you guys to check out Roamly. If you're looking for RV insurance, or even if you have RV insurance, go ahead and check them out, compare their rates, and then decide if their coverage is something that can work for you. I want to remind you that the RV Entrepreneur Summit is happening 7 through 11 September in Montrose, Colorado. That again is a campground straight out of the RV entrepreneur community. If you're going through Swan Valley, Idaho, Eastern Idaho, definitely check out the park at Swan Valley, Bryson, Nelly, Jersey. But if you're going through Colorado, anytime outside of the summit, check out the Campers Hub with Scott and Taylor. It's really cool how many members of the RV entrepreneur community are now starting to own and operate campgrounds. And I think that bodes really well for us nomadic entrepreneurs going forward, is that we're going to have a lot more places to go with amenities that cater towards what we need. And so if you're interested in attending the summit, go ahead and check it out at therventrepreneur.com/summit. Jump on over to the Facebook group, join in the conversation there as well. And with that, that's all I have for today. I'll see you on the next episode. Happy trails.